President Trump is facing widespread condemnation for his handling of the unrest in dozens of American cities. Violent clashes between police and protesters continue after the death of a black man being detained by police. But the president issued this warning.
If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
Mr. Trump's likely rival in November's election coming out swinging. Joe Biden accuses the president of fanning the flames of hate. We start in the United States, where President Trump is facing widespread condemnation for his handling of the unrest in dozens of American cities. It follows the killing of George Floyd, an African-American who died last week in Minneapolis while being detained by police. Aleem Maqbool has the latest from Washington.
Lock him up! Lock him up!
Undeterred, they're outside the White House again. But the focus of their anger now is not just violent police officers who kill unarmed black men, but the president as well.
It's terrible that people can't protest, which, by the way, is their First Amendment right. President Trump likes to talk a lot about the Second Amendment, owning guns and everything, but won't even comment when we come to do what we are literally raised to do, born to do as Americans.
Donald Trump himself has appeared quite pleased with the way he has, in his words, dominated with overwhelming force. But those subjected to that force here late yesterday were peaceful protesters out in the memory of George Floyd.
As we speak, I am dispatching thousands and thousands of heavily armed soldiers, military personnel, and law enforcement officers.
And with that, demonstrators were gassed and shoved and pushed back from the historic church outside which they'd been protesting, though it was well before any curfew.
I feel like I'm not even feeling 1/8 of what black people feel every single day, and I'm terrified.
And what was it all for, particularly outside the church? Well, this. The president took a short walk to St. John's to show he's in control and apparently to pose with a Bible. Donald Trump's Democratic presidential rival has been critical of his handling of this crisis.
The country is crying out for leadership. Leadership that can unite us, leadership that brings us together, leadership that can recognize pain and deep grief of communities that have had a knee on their neck for a long time.
But the security forces continue to force back demonstrators on the orders of a president who's claimed to be a champion of free speech. But there's a sense that this will go on.
We've been Martin Luther King for ages, for generations on end. It's time for Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey. Like, no justice, no peace. Like, that's not just a mantra anymore. That's about to be a way of life.
Although the military and the police have fairly successfully shut down a lot of zones across the American capital, there are still large pockets of protest traveling throughout the city, determined to continue to demonstrate.
Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter!
The president may have disrupted the protests in Washington and with it dealt with some of the looting, but his critics feel his actions compared to those of authoritarian leaders around the world the US would previously have condemned. Aleem Maqbool, BBC News in Washington.
Well, there have been protests across the United States, including in Minneapolis, the city where Mr. Floyd was killed. Our correspondent Barbara Plett-Usher is there with the latest.
Minneapolis is reclaiming the place that sent the city into spasms of anger and unrest. Smothering with flowers the spot where George Floyd stopped breathing, pinned down by a police officer's knee on his neck. It's become a pilgrimage site for those demanding justice for George.
Black lives! Black lives!
At the state capitol, a sit-in echoing the civil rights movement. 60 years later, still demanding equal justice for African Americans, especially an end to police brutality against black people. The Minnesota government has announced it will investigate the conduct of the state's largest police department, stretching back 10 years. In Houston, Texas, it seemed like the whole city had turned out to march for Mr. Floyd. Members of his family joined them. This is where he grew up and where he'll be buried. packed streets in New York City, emptied out in recent months to contain the coronavirus pandemic, now full once again with protesters. The anger has taken a destructive turn here, as it has elsewhere.
I mean, unfortunately, there are people out here looting, but you can't tell angry people how they can be angry. You know, that's like telling the slaves not to burn down Master's house.
But this looked like more than protest about racial injustice. In Manhattan, bands of young people dressed mostly in black took advantage of the unrest to pillage stores that had been shuttered because of the coronavirus. Police struggled to respond, and the mayor imposed a curfew, a double quarantine. The vast majority of protests are peaceful, but it doesn't take much for the mood to change. Police have been responding with more and more force. And they have been attacked. In several cities last night, 4 were shot and injured in St. Louis.
Some coward fired shots at officers, and now we have 4 in the hospital. But thankfully, and thank God, they're alive. They're alive. But can we make some sense out of this? Can we make some sense out of this?
Take a knee!
Police are struggling to make sense of their role, to restore law and order, but also respond to the tragedy of Minneapolis.
We're appalled at what happened in Minneapolis. Period. But we gotta do better.
In that city, faith leaders made clear they were siding with those calling for justice. People are demanding that all of the officers involved in Mr. Floyd's arrest be charged. Accountability in this case might be the beginning of an answer, but only the beginning. Barbara Platt-Usher, BBC News, Minneapolis.
Well, as you can see behind me, live pictures there of protesters in Washington. Thousands of people have been gathering in many cities around the US. Of course, just to point out to you that the curfew is due to begin at 7 p.m. local time. It's now 7 minutes past local time. And these protesters, it looks like, are protesting around Lafayette Square, which only around this time yesterday was cleared by police for President Trump to walk to the St. John's Episcopal Church, where he held a Bible and had photographers and reporters take photos of him. These peaceful protests have been going on across the United States for about 7 days now, since the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. We'll bring you, of course, more on these protests around the United States as and when we get it here on BBC World News.
Relatives of George Floyd, the black man killed as he was detained by police in Minneapolis, have accompanied, it's estimated, 60,000 people on a memorial march through his hometown of Houston, Texas. He'll be buried there as well. George Floyd's brother, Terrence, has again called for peace. These are the latest live shots we're seeing from around the United States after 7 nights of angry protests over the killing. Evening curfews are in place in many major cities. As you can see, though, the protests are still happening. They appear to remain peaceful. Many people simply lying flat on the ground with their hands behind their backs. Much more on all the news anytime on the BBC website. Thanks for watching.